Hello there. My name's Austin, and I would like to welcome you to Chapter 8 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now we're starting to get into the end game here, as the book only has 10 chapters. So I hope you enjoy as we cruise on through right to the finale. When his servant entered, he looked at him steadfastly, and wondered if he had thought of peering behind the screen. The man was quite impassive and waited for his orders. Dorian lit a cigarette and walked over to the glass and glanced into it. He could see the reflection of Victor's face perfectly. It was like a placid mask of servility. There was nothing to be afraid of there, yet he thought it was best to be on his guard. Speaking very slowly, he told him to tell the housekeeper that he wanted to see her, and then to go to the frame makers and ask him to send 2 of his men round at once. It seemed to him that as the man left the room, he peered in the direction of the screen. Or was that only his fancy? After a few moments, Miss Leaf, the dear old lady in a black silk dress with a photograph of the late Mr. Leaf framed in a gold brooch around her neck, and old-fashioned thread mittens on her wrinkled hands, bustled into the room. "Well, Master Dorian," she said, "what can I do for you?" "I beg your pardon, sir." Here came a curtsy. "I shouldn't call you Master Dorian anymore. But Lord bless you, sir, I've known you since you were a baby. And many's the trick you played on poor old Leif. Not that you are not always a good boy, sir, but boys will be boys, Master Dorian, and jam is a temptation to the young, isn't it, sir?" He laughed. "You must always call me Master Dorian Leif. I'll be very angry with you if you don't, and I assure you I'm quite as fond of jam now as I used to be. Only when I'm asked out to tea, I'm never offered any. I want you to give me the key to the room at the top of the house." "The old schoolroom, Master Dorian." "Why, it's full of dust. I must get it arranged and put straight before you go into it. It's not fit for you to see, Master Dorian. It's not indeed." "I don't want it put straight, Leaf. I only want the key." "Well, Master Dorian, you'll be covered in cobwebs if you goes into it." "Why, it hasn't been opened for nearly 5 years, not since his lordship died." He winced at the mention of his dead uncle's name. He had hateful memories of him. "That does not matter, Leaf," he replied. "All I want is the key." "And here is the key, Master Dorian," said the old lady, after going over the contents of her bunch with a tremulously uncertain hand. "Here is the key. I'll have it off the ring in a moment. But you don't think of living up there, Master Dorian? And you so comfortably?" "No, Leaf, I don't. I merely want to see the place and perhaps store something in it. That's all." "Thank you, Leaf. I hope your rheumatism is better. And mind you, send me up jam for breakfast." Miss Leaf shook her head. "Them foreigners don't understand jam, Master Dorian. They call it compote. But I'll bring it to you myself in the morning, if you lets me." "That'll be very kind of you, Leaf," he answered. Looking at the key and having made him an elaborate curtsy, the old lady left the room, her face wreathed in smiles. She had a strong objection to the French valet. It was a poor thing, she felt, for anyone to be born a foreigner. As the door closed, Dorian put the key in his pocket and looked around the room. His eye fell on a large purple satin coverlet, heavily embroidered with gold, a splendid piece of late 17th century Venetian work that his uncle had found in a convent near Bologna. Yes, that would serve to wrap the dreadful thing in. It had perhaps served often as a pall for the dead. Now it was to hide something that had a corruption of its own, worse than the corruption of death itself. Something that would breed horrors and yet would never die. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image on the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away at its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful. And yet the thing would still live on. It would always be alive. He shuddered, and for a moment he regretted that he had not told Basil the true reason why he had wished to hide the picture away. Basil would have helped him to resist the Lord Henry's influence, and still more poisonous influences that came from his own temperament. The love that he bore him. For it was really love. Had something noble and intellectual about it. It was not a mere physical admiration of beauty that is born of the senses, and that dies when the senses tire. It was such love as Michelangelo had known, and Montaigne and Winckelmann and Shakespeare himself. Yes, Basil could have saved him. But it was too late now. The past could always be annihilated. Regret, denial, or forgetfulness could do that. But the future was inevitable. There were passions in him that would find their terrible outlet dreams that would make a shadow of their evil real. He took it up from the couch, the great purple and gold texture that covered it, and holding it in his hands, passed behind the screen. Was the face on the canvas viler than before? It seemed to him that it was unchanged, and yet his loathing of it was intensified. Gold hair, blue eyes, and rose-red lips. They were all there. It was simply the expression that had altered. That was horrible in its cruelty. Compared to what he saw in it, of censure, of rebuke, how shallow Basil's reproaches about Sybil Vane had been. How shallow, and of what little account. His own soul was looking out at him from the canvas and calling him to judgment. A look of pain came across him, and he flung the rich pal over the picture. As he did so, a knock came to the door. He passed out as his servant entered. The persons are here, monsieur. He felt that the man must be gotten rid of at once. He must not be allowed to know where the picture was being taken to. There was something sly about him, and he had thoughtful, treacherous eyes. Sitting down at the writing table, he scribbled a note to Lord Henry, asking him to send him around something to read, and reminding him that they were to meet at 8:15 that evening. Wait for an answer, he said, handing it to him, and show the men in here. In 2 or 3 minutes there was another knock, and Mr. Ashton himself, the celebrated frame maker of the South Audley Street, came in with a somewhat rough-looking young assistant. Mr. Ashton was a florid, red-whiskered little man, whose admiration for art was considerably tempered by the inveterate this is a difficult word to pronounce, my apologies. Impecuniosity of most of the artists who dealt with him. As a rule, he never left his shop. He waited for people to come to him, but he always made an exception in favor of Dorian Gray. There was something about Dorian that charmed everybody. It was a pleasure even to see him. "And what can I do for you, Mr. Gray?" he said, rubbing his fat, freckled hands together. "I thought I would do myself the honour of coming around in person. I've just got a beauty of a frame, sir. Picked it up on sale, old Florentine. Came from Fonthill, I believe. Admirably suited for a religious picture, Mr. Gray." "I'm so sorry to have given you the trouble of coming around, Mr. Ashton. I will certainly drop in and look at the frame, though I don't go in much for religious art. But today I only want a picture carried to the top of the house for me. It's rather heavy, so I would ask you to lend me a couple of your men." "No trouble at all, Mr. Gray. I'm delighted to be of any service to you. And which is the work of art, sir?" "This," replied Dorian, moving the screen back. "Can you move it, covering and all, just as it is? I don't want it to get scratched going up the stairs." "There'll be no difficulty, sir," said the genial frame maker, beginning, with the aid of his assistant, to unhook the picture from the long brass chains by which it was suspended. "And now, where shall we carry it to, Mr. Gray?" "I'll show you the way, Mr. Ashton, if you'll kindly follow me. Or perhaps you had better go in front. I'm afraid it's right at the top of the house. We'll go up by the front staircase. It's wider." He held the door open for them, and they passed out into the hall and began the ascent. The elaborate character of the frame had made the picture extremely bulky, and now and then, in spite of the obsequious protests of Mr. Ashton, who had a true tradesman's dislike of seeing a gentleman doing anything useful, Dorian put his hand to it so as to help them. "Something of a load to carry, sir," gasped the little man when they reached the top landing, and he wiped his shiny forehead. "A terrible load to carry," murmured Dorian as he unlocked the door that opened into the room that was to keep for him the curious secret of life that hides his soul from the eyes of men. He had not entered the place for more than 4 years, not indeed since he had used it as a playroom when he was a child, and then as a study when he grew somewhat older. It was a large, well-proportioned room which had been specially built by the last Lord Sherrard for the use of his little nephew, whom, being himself childless, and perhaps for other reasons, he had always hated and desired to keep at a distance. It did not appear to Dorian to have much changed. There was the huge Italian cassone, with its fantastically painted panels and its tarnished gilt moldings, in which he had so often hidden himself as a boy. There was the satinwood bookcase, filled with his dog-eared schoolbooks. On the wall behind it was hanging the same ragged Flemish tapestry, where a faded king and queen were playing chess in a garden, while the company of hawkers rode by, carrying hooded birds on their gauntleted wrists. How well he recalled it all. Every moment of his lonely childhood came back to him as he looked around. He remembered the stainless purity of his boyish life, and it seemed horrible to him that it was here that the fatal portrait would be hidden away. How little he had thought in those dead days of all that was in store for him. But there was no other place in the house so secure from prying eyes as this. He had the key and no one else could enter it. Beneath its purple pall, the face painted on the canvas could grow bestial, sodden, and unclean. What did it matter? No one could see it. He himself would not see it. Why should he watch the hideous corruption of his soul? He kept his youth, and that was enough. And besides, might not his nature grow finer after all? There was no reason that the future should be so full of shame. Some love might come across his life and purify him and shield him from those sins that seemed to be already stirring in the spirit and flesh. Those curious unpictured sins whose very mystery lent them to their subtlety and their charm. Perhaps someday the cruel look would have passed away from the scarlet sensitive mouth, and he might show the world Basil Hallward's masterpiece. No, that was impossible. The thing upon the canvas was growing old, hour by hour and week by week. Even if it escaped the hideousness of sin, the hideousness of age was in store for it. The cheeks would hollow or flaccid. Yellow crow's feet would creep around the fading eyes and make them horrible. The hair would lose its brightness and the mouth would gape or droop, would be foolish or gross as the mouths of old men are. There would be the wrinkled throat, the cold blue-veined hands, the twisted body that he remembered in the uncle who had been so stern to him in his boyhood. The picture had to be concealed. There was no help in it. "Bring it in, Mr. Ashton, please," he said wearily, turning round. "I'm sorry I kept you for so long. I was thinking of something else." "Always glad to have a rest, Mr. Gray," answered the frame maker, who was still gasping for breath. "Where shall we put it, sir?" "Oh, anywhere. Here, this will do. I don't want to have it hung up, just lean it against the wall. Thank you." "Might one look at the work of art, sir?" Dorian started. "It would not interest you, Mr. Ashton," he said, keeping his eye on the man. He felt ready to leap upon him and fling him to the ground if he dared to lift the gorgeous hanging that concealed the secret of his life. "I won't trouble you any more now. I'm much obligated for your kindness in coming around." "No, not at all, Mr. Gray. Ever ready to do anything for you, sir." And Mr. Ashton tramped down the stairs, followed by the assistant, who glanced back at Dorian with a look of shy wonder through his rough, uncomely face. He'd never seen anyone so marvelous. When the sound of their footsteps had died away, Dorian locked the door and put the key in his pocket. He felt safe now. No one would ever look on the horrible thing. No eye but his would ever see his shame. On reaching the library, he found that it was just after 5 o'clock, and that the tea had already been brought up. On a little table of dark perfumed wood, thickly encrusted with nacre, a present from his guardian's wife, Lady Radley, who had spent the preceding winter in Cairo, was lying a note from Lord Henry, and beside it was a book bound in yellow paper, the cover slightly torn and the edges soiled. A copy of the 3rd edition of the St. James Gazette had been placed on the tea tray. It was evident that Victor had returned. He wondered if he had met the men in the hall as they were leaving the house, and had wormed them out because of what they had been doing. He would be sure to miss the picture, had no doubt missed it already while he had been laying the tea things. The screen had not been replaced, and the blank space on the wall was visible. Perhaps some night he might find him creeping up the stairs and trying to force the door of the room. It was a horrible thing to have a spy in one's own home. He had heard of rich men who had been blackmailed all their lives by some servant who had read a letter, or overheard a conversation, or picked up a card with an address, or found beneath a pillow a withered flower or a bit of crumpled lace. He sighed, and having poured himself out some tea, opened Lord Henry's note. It was simply to say that he had sent him round the evening paper, and a book that might interest him, and that he would be at the club at 8:15. He opened the St. James languidly, and looked through it. A red pencil mark on the 5th page caught his eye. He read the following paragraph. "Inquest on an actress. An inquest was held this morning at the Bell Tavern, Hoxton Road, by Mr. Danby, the district coroner, on the body of Sybil Vane, a young actress recently engaged at the Royal Theatre, Holborn. A verdict of death by misadventure was returned. Considerable sympathy was expressed for the mother of the deceased, who was greatly affected during the giving of her own evidence, and that of Dr. Burrell, who had made the post-mortem examination of the deceased. He frowned slightly, and tearing the paper into two, went across the room and flung the pieces into a gilt basket. How ugly it all was! How horribly real ugliness made things! He felt a little annoyed with Lord Henry for having sent him the account, and it was certainly stupid of him for him to have marked it with a red pencil. Victor might have read it. The man knew more than enough English for that. Perhaps he had read it and begun to suspect something. And yet what did it matter? What had Dorian Gray to do with Sybil Vane's death? There was nothing to fear. Dorian Gray had not killed her. His eye fell to the yellow book that Lord Henry had sent him. What was it, he wondered? He went towards the little pearl-covered octagonal stand that had always looked to him like the work of some strange Egyptian bees who had wrought it in silver, and took the volume up. He flung himself onto an open armchair and began to turn over the leaves. After a few minutes, he became absorbed. It was the strangest book that he had ever read. It seemed to him that in exquisite rhyme and to the delicate sound of the flutes, the sins of the world were passing in dumb show before him. Things that he had dimly dreamed of were suddenly made real to him. Things of which he had never dreamed were gradually revealed. It was a novel without a plot, and with only one character being, indeed, simply a psychological study of a certain young Parisian who spent his life trying to realize in the 19th century all of the passions and modes of thought that belonged to every century except his own, and to sum up, as it were, in himself the various moods through which the world spirit had ever passed, loving for their mere artificiality those renunciations that men have unwisely called virtue, as much as those natural rebellions whose wise men still call sin. The style in which it was written was that curious jeweled style, vivid and obscure all at once, full of argot and of archaisms, of technical expressions and of elaborate paraphrases that characterized the work of some of the finest artists in the French school of decadence. There were in it metaphors as monstrous as orchids, as evil in color. The life of the senses was described in the terms of mystical philosophy. One hardly knew at times whether one was reading the spiritual ecstasies of some medieval saint or the morbid confessions of a modern sinner. It was a poisonous book. The heavy odor of incense seemed to cling about its pages and to trouble the brain. The mere cadence of sentences, the subtle monotony of their music, so full as it was of complex refrains, and movements elaborately repeated, produced in the mind of the lad, as he passed from chapter to chapter, a form of reverie, a malady of dreaming that made him unconscious of the falling day and the creeping shadows. Cloudless and pierced by one solitary star, a copper-green sky gleamed through the windows. He read on by its wan light till he could read no more. Then, after his valet had reminded him several times of the lateness of the hour, he got up and, going into the next room, placed the book on a little Florentine table that always stood at his bedside, and then began to dress for dinner. It was almost 9 o'clock before he reached the club, where he found Lord Henry sitting alone, and, in the morning room, looking very bored. "I'm so sorry, Harry," he cried, "but really it's entirely your fault. The book you sent me fascinated me so that I forgot what the time was." "I thought you would like it," replied his host, rising from his chair. "I didn't say I liked it, Harry. I said it fascinated me. There's a great difference." "Ha! If you've discovered that, then you've discovered a great deal," murmured Lord Henry, with his curious smile. "Come, let us go to dinner. It's dreadfully late, and I'm afraid the champagne will be far too much iced." And with that, we have Chapter 8. Only 2 more chapters to go, and that'll be a wrap. But as for now, I hope you're tucked in, well rested, and that your belly's full. Have a good evening, and I'll see you next time.